as she alluded to about my experience, I've been a software developer myself for 25 years. I have only worked at startups, most of them that I've created. I've never worked in corporate America. I would never want to work in corporate America. I love building things, I love innovating, and that's one of the fun things we get to do at Full Scale is we work with 60 or 70 other clients, helping them build cool stuff and innovate. So I've been an entrepreneur for about 20 years, founder of 3 different SaaS companies that I've all sold. One of them actually closes tomorrow, on Monday actually. So what we're going to talk about today is how to be a better software engineer or a better software developer. Not just a coder or a programmer. We're going to talk about the difference of what it really means to be a better software engineer. And the big hint here is, it's not about writing code. The job of a software engineer is not to write code. That's what we're going to be focusing on today. So when you go to build software, there are 3 pieces to it. It's the problem, the solution, and then the delivery or execution of that solution, right? So most of the time, software developers feel like they live over here. They live in the delivery. Like I get a Jira ticket, I do my Jira ticket, that's my job, right? But what we're going to talk about today is how software developers really need to spend more of their time over here. And if you want to be a better software developer, a senior software developer, an architect, a manager, a chief technology officer, a startup founder, any of these things, you have to live here. You live over here, you don't live over there. That's what we're going to talk about today. The real focus of a software developer needs to be more about what should we build, not how should we build it, right? We had a great panel earlier about the government leaders, talking about different things. I actually own a house in Cebu, I own a car in Cebu. And, I'm probably past due on my taxes. Partly because the government doesn't tell me that I even owe the taxes. I can't pay the money online. That's a problem for the government, right? If the government would solve this, I would pay my taxes quicker. This is the problem, right? And as software developers, we get paid to solve those problems. Like to the government should spend a lot of money to solve that problem because the government will get more money. They will get my money quicker, right? People don't pay for writing code. They pay for solving problems, right? That's the key. It's all about solving problems. So, as a software developer, mostly what we get are really stupid product requirements, right? Most of you can attest to this. You get some Jira ticket, whatever it is, and it'll say something like this: add a drop down for this thing, whatever. That's all you get. So we did this at one of my companies this week. We have a integration with Google. We control Google Ads, pay-per-click ads on Google. You can just search for Google, all the Google ads, right? Well, we're building an integration to Microsoft Bing for the ads. So we're like, okay, we need to add a drop-down. And the drop-down needs to allow you to select if you're paying for cost per acquisition or you're paying cost per click. Sounds simple, right? We just add a drop-down, add a field in the database, and boom, we're done. But it's not that simple. If you don't think about the big picture and think about, well, why are we adding this drop-down? What was the point of doing this to begin with? You will have missed 90% of the work. You will immediately have a whole slew of bugs and a bunch of complaints from the users because it doesn't do what it was supposed to do. And the reason why is, well, now we have this integration with Microsoft Bing, and if I change it from cost per click to cost per acquisition, we'll have to change all these other things. I have to change the integration. When I go into the UI and I click that drop down and I save it, it's got to immediately synchronize that. Like, there's all of these things that have to happen. But as a developer, if you don't stop and think, why are we doing this? You would make that mistake. You're like, I added the drop down, I'm done. What's my next Jira ticket? That's not your job. Your job is to understand the problem. Why are we doing this? Okay, well, if we're doing this, this is going to have all of these downstream effects. We have to think about all these other things, right? That is the difference between your typical developer and a really good senior developer. They understand the difference of these things. So, let's talk about requirements for a minute. Most time, from a user, your product team, product owner, manager, somebody, they give you this requirement, the product requirement. And maybe it would say, add a drop-down, implement how this works in the sync to Microsoft Bing, whatever, right? But here's the problem. These are not technical requirements. Technical requirements are very different. And the product team does not understand technical requirements. Okay, so let's talk about what that means. Here's an example of some of the technical requirements. Okay, so what was the UX design for this thing? Where do I put this in the database? What do I change? What do I name the column? What user has access to change this dropdown? What is the default value for this dropdown? What is the default value for this database column that I'm adding for all of my existing customers? Is there a background process that happens when I change this dropdown? In this example, there was, a very, very important one. What kind of security concerns do we have with this thing? Are there performance concerns? Well, in our case, we don't want the synchronization to Microsoft to go crazy. Like performance for that could be important. What kind of integrations? This for Microsoft Bing integration was really important. The whole thing is about an integration. What kind of testing do we need to do with this thing? What kind of acceptance criteria maybe do we have? Hey, we built this, we deployed it. How do we know if it really works? Right? Do we have to change anything with our deployments? Most of the time we don't. Sometimes making changes to something needs a lot of changes to our deployments. How do we monitor if this thing works? How do I know if my integration to Microsoft Bing works? How do I monitor that thing? Right? Do I need to add logging to know to troubleshoot this thing? How would I troubleshoot this thing to know if it works or doesn't work? Are we going to add documentation? What about auditing? How do I know what user logged in and changed this dropdown from one thing to another? Okay, so these are all just examples. These are examples of the kinds of things. As a software developer, when somebody comes to you and says, I need you to do this thing, in your head, you have to think of all these things. They all have to run through your head. And as a junior software developer, you know none of this. You're like, I have no idea. I'll add the dropdown. Yes, sir, here you go. Boom, dropdown. As a senior developer, you're like, you know what? There's probably more to this. I need to ask some questions, right? That's the key. And if you focus on the problem, you start to understand some of these things, and you get better and better at asking the questions, thinking through the fact that I'm building software, I'm not writing code. If I'm building software, I know these kinds of things matter, okay? So, as software developers, we need to be focused on all three phases of this: the problem, the solution, and the delivery. The most important thing you can do is simply ask why. Why are we doing this? I asked ChatGPT to make me a picture of somebody who was a software developer but who was a doctor. This is what I got. And I did that because I feel like as software developers, that's part of our job. What does a doctor do? You go into a doctor and you're like, I have this problem. I don't know how to solve it. What is wrong with me? Here are my symptoms. This is what I'm having experience with. What's wrong, right? And a lot of times as software developers, that's our job. We're trying to figure out what is wrong with this person. How do I solve their problem and make them go away, right? But it comes down to asking questions. It's all about asking the right questions, okay? So ultimately, what we have to figure out is the who, what, where, why, when of things, right? So we need to know, why are we doing this? When are we doing it? What's the deadline? Where does this change go? Who is going to use this change? What is the actual change that we're going to do? Does it have performance and scale issues? Because that creates a bunch of different problems. And then lastly, how, right? If you know these things, how is really easy. It's actually not that hard. Software developers spend less than 20% of their time writing code. They spend 80% of their time reading code and doing all of these things, okay? Earlier, to start the day, Landon talked about AI and how it's impacting software development, how it's changing the skill gap. That's mostly impacting this. It's not impacting this. It's not going to get product owners to give you requirements that make any sense. they're going to ask you add a dropdown, right? AI is not going to solve that problem. Most of what software developers do is have to figure out what is the problem we're trying to solve and how are we going to solve it. Once you figure that part out, writing code is the easy part. Now, if you have 1 year of experience as a software developer, you're probably listening to me and you're like, Matt, it's not the easy part. And I get that. After doing this for 25 years, I could do that part in my sleep, right? It's like the Matrix to me. I see code everywhere. You tell me the problem, I can tell you how to write the code. It's not a problem. Architecture like this, boom, 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 go, right? But this part is really freaking hard. It's always really hard, okay? And that is the biggest value of a software developer, is focusing on this part over here. But here's the problem. This is the problem that every software developer has. You got the problem over here, the code is over here, and you live over here. You are so close to the code that you don't understand the problem. How do we solve that? That's what we're gonna talk about that. Okay? I was lucky in my career. The first job I ever had, I worked for a company that resold concert and sports tickets. I was the only software developer. So guess where I lived? I lived over here. I was the only person. I didn't have a boss. Nobody told me what to do. If one of our customers had a problem, they called me. I had to figure it all out. I had to understand their problems. I flew all over the United States, talking to our customers, installing our software. I lived here. I actually did this when I was on a plane, flying between our customers, trying to figure out how to do this stuff, okay? That has made my career very unique. I started my career focused on the problems and the product. How do we make an amazing product, not amazing code? My entire career has been focused on the problem and the product. Now, a lot of companies, so this is where we need to be. We need to be closer over here, right? In a lot of companies, you get something like this. You got the users over here. You got a product team that sort of understand the users, hopefully. You got dev management, and you got developers, engineers over here, okay? Usually you get a spectrum like this, and sometimes this helps. Like the product team can do a really good job. They get really good requirements. They'll distill that information and give it to you guys. Ideally, we want everybody to be closer over here, right? We want to get as close to the problem as possible, okay? The closer you are to the problem, the better the solution you can figure out, and the easier it will be to deliver the solution that is needed. What's interesting about software development is a lot of times when somebody comes in, they're like, I have this problem, I need you to fix it, they don't even actually describe a problem. They really describe the symptoms. So like, I have a stomach ache, I don't know what's wrong, but fix my stomach ache. And not, they don't understand like what the problem is, like what is causing it, right? And the value of a really, really good software developer is they're kind of like that doctor. They're like, you know what? I've heard this before. I've built a lot of software. I understand what you're probably trying to do. And you can come up with much better solutions, right? But part of the reason that you can do that is you spend a lot of time over here understanding the problems, understanding how to build good software. So again, what we need to do is focus on all three of these things: the why, the what, and the how. Okay? Now, how do we do that? It starts with asking better questions. Okay? The biggest difference between a junior developer and a senior developer: senior developers ask better questions. They've done this for a long time. They know, okay, when they change this dropdown, we're gonna have to rethink the integration. I just know that, right? A senior developer would ask those questions. They ask different and better questions, okay? The key is asking the questions. And the more experience you have, the better questions you will ask. And one of the trouble with a lot of software developers, they don't have the greatest communication skills, right? Well, I'm gonna tell you right now, it doesn't matter how good of a software developer you are, if I can't communicate to you what needs to be done, it doesn't matter if you can do it or not. It doesn't matter if you know how to write the code. If we don't have good communication skills about what needs to be done, okay? That is the blocker for you actually being able to do it, okay? Asking better questions is really important. So, putting this another way, I really like this chart. I think of myself as a product engineer. For the last 25 years, this is where I have lived. You give me the ideas, help build a roadmap, I can build this thing, we can test it, we can release it, support. I do all of it. I understand all of it from start to finish. You know what that means? I know how to build really good products, right? That's the difference. And ultimately, what this all comes down to, and probably one of the easiest ways to describe this whole thing, comes down to ownership. If you own something and you care about it, you will build a better product, a better thing, whatever it is. Now, as a software developer, you aren't necessarily going to own the whole system. You're not going to be the developer in charge of the entire company, right? That might be the CTO or lead developer or somebody. But it can start with like, hey, I own this class library. I own this product feature. I own this product module. I own this product. You get to some companies that have multiple products. Like, who owns multiple products, right? Ultimately, it comes down to ownership, but it comes down to that mentality. You have the mentality of like, I own this thing. I have to understand how it works. I have to understand all of it. And if you think about it from an ownership perspective, it'll make more sense. You need to have ownership in things. And ultimately what this creates is this. That gap goes away. You fill the whole gap. So, does anybody here know a 10x developer? I'm one of them. And the difference is, I can figure out the problem, I can figure out how to solve it, and I can write the code. You know what that means? Nothing is slowing me down. I can move very quickly, right? And you can too. It comes down to ownership. It comes down to thinking about the product and the whole thing from start to finish. If you have ownership of what needs to be accomplished. And ultimately, this is how you become a CTO or a founder of a company. She mentioned in the intro, I host a podcast and newsletter called Startup Hustle. You can Google Startup Hustle, startuphustlenews.com, subscribe to my newsletter, follow me on LinkedIn, whatever. And I did a survey, and about half of all CTOs, you know how they became a CTO? They started their own company. They didn't get promoted to do it. If you want to be a CTO, the best way to do it is to start your own company. But ultimately, to do that, you've got to be really good at product. You've got to be really good at problems, right? Most CTOs understand the product vision of what needs to be built and how to build it, and they can execute on it. All right, so here are some things to think about. I mentioned earlier, you have to ask why. You need to talk to the users. You need to talk to customers. You can't sit in your cubicle in the basement somewhere and only think about the code. You've got to talk to people. You've got to talk to users. You've got to talk to customers. And I know that's hard for some of you. You're like, Matt, I never get a chance to talk to those people. That's okay. Here's some other ideas. You need to be part of the product planning. Figure out, hey, I want to go to the planning meeting. I want to understand what we're building, why we're building it, the roadmap. I want to understand. I want to have ownership of this thing. I want to have input. I want to have some thought leadership into this thing. Okay? Watch a recorded sales demo. One of the most eye-opening things you ever have is see how potential customers think and react to the product you're building. What are the questions they ask? If you can't talk to users and customers, ask for a recording. Just give me a recording. I want to see what kind of questions the customers ask. Okay? You can also research the industry. Whatever you're doing, go research the competitors. Play with the products. Learn. Again, take ownership and take some initiative. And ultimately, one of the biggest things that software developers really struggle with is user empathy. If you don't have empathy for your users, you're never going to build a good product. Because at the end of the day, we don't write code to write code. We write code for our users. And if you can't empathize with them on why they're even using your product, you're never going to build a good product. It's really important, even though users are a pain in the butt. All right, last thing we're talking about real quick is simplify. Okay, one of the other challenges that software developers have, and I was guilty of this, we tend to overcomplicate everything. And I wrote a blog post a few months ago about how my 25-year career was all technical debt. It was all deprecated. Literally everything I've ever built in my career is gone. They have rewritten it. It was in Visual Basic 6, it was in Microsoft Silverlight, it was in Microsoft.NET Compact Framework, it was active server pages, whatever. It was all this junk that's gone. It's long gone, okay? Or the company has been shut down, or this or that. Whatever the reason, it's all gone, okay? And as software developers, we tend to overcomplicate everything. The thing we have to remember is, again, we're trying to build the best product, not the best code. And there's a balance somewhere in the middle, right? And keeping in mind that almost all the code that we build will eventually be thrown away, okay? So I really like this quote. A junior developer writes simple code for solving simple problems. A mid-level developer writes complex code for solving complex problems. A senior developer writes simple code for solving complex problems. This is the key. With more experience, you figure out how to do things in simpler and simpler ways. But the problem for most software developers is this. They start out, and around 3 to 10 years of experience, they're like, hey, I need to add all this abstractions, all these interfaces, solid principles, test-driven development, this thing, microservices, all this stuff. And what does that do? Complexity, right? I'm over here. After 25 years, give me the simplest code in the world. It's easy to support. I can make changes to it. I know how to work on it. I can hire anybody to figure out how to fix it. When it's way up there, I'm gonna need a genius to fix this thing, right? I'll give you another example of that in a minute. So look at this car. If this car was broken, does it look easy to fix? No, it does not. You add all this kind of junk, you get a car like this, right? All of these things have a purpose, a time and a place. I've worked on systems that process billions of data points a day. And we had event streaming and all sorts of complex stuff with Kafka and all the cloud and Kubernetes. I've worked on that stuff. All of them were a nightmare. You don't want to use any of those things unless you have to. They all have a time and place where they're valuable, right? If not, it overcomplicates everything. Does anybody know what this is? It might be the most reliable engine in the world. Could you fix this thing? Could you fix this? The people who own these fix them. You guys know what this is? It's the engine to this. That's what's under the hood. It's easy. It works. It's simple. It's easy to repair. It's a lot easier to fix than this thing, right? So, one of the key things I want you guys to remember is simplicity is always important. As software developers, we tend to overcomplicate things. And part of it is we think that as we go from being a junior developer to mid-level developer, that we need to use this abstraction, this interface, this thing, and somehow that makes us a better developer. Knowing that those things exist and knowing when to use them makes you a better developer, not just blindly using them, okay? A lot of developers make these mistakes. They make software so complicated. All right, so wrapping up here. Again, asking the right questions is really important. It's really the difference between being a junior developer and a senior developer. Talking to users and customers is really important. Being involved in product planning is important. Taking ownership is really important. And you don't have to own the whole company, right? You need to own a product, a feature, a module, something. Own something and be the expert at it. And fight for it. One of the challenges that we have as software developers is you've got to have an opinion. You've got to be willing to fight for something. You're like, you know what? This is why we need to do this thing. I think this database technology or this thing or whatever it is, this product feature, whatever it is, you've got to be willing to fight for it and be a leader and take ownership as well, especially if you want to be a senior developer, an architect, a manager. You can't just sit around waiting for somebody to tell you what to do, or otherwise you will spend your whole career waiting for somebody to tell you what to do. You've got to take ownership. That's the key. You've got to take ownership and lead. And that could be in a small segment. It doesn't mean you lead the whole company or own the whole company. It means you lead and own a small part of it. And eventually, as you get more experience, that gets bigger and bigger. Need to focus on the product, not the code, and some more code is always better. Don't make things complicated unless they have to be complicated. It's one of the most important things. I mentioned earlier about my podcast, my newsletter. You guys can search, you can follow me. I'm the founder and CEO of Full Scale. We have about 300 employees that work in the Philippines. We're always hiring every week. You can check us out. I want to real quickly say thank you for everybody putting on the show. This is my first time in Mindanao. I probably traveled the farthest to get here. I live in Kansas City, which is 13,000 kilometers away from here. It's a long ways away. But thank you guys for having me. I've actually been to the Philippines, I think, 17 times, a lot of times over the last several years. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you very much, Sir Matt Watson, CEO of Full Scale. Ayan. I would like to request the DEVCON Davao VP for Finance, Joshua Pregua, to award the certificate of appreciation to Sir Matt Watson in recognition of your insightful contributions and dedicated participation as a panelist during the DEVCON Mindanao Summit 2024. Your expertise has significantly enriched the discussion, creating a valuable learning experience and inspiring attendees. Awarded this June 29, 2024, signed Rina Faye Sumarago, DEVCON Mindanao Summit 2024 Director, and Sir Dom De Leon, Executive Director of DEVCON Philippines.